Welcome and welcome. 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 Internet friends. To Thoughtcraft Cast. Holy crap. We like to talk about music.
You watched it last Friday and we're talking about it now. Where it's like, let's come up with a challenge.
It's between you being cute.
Because that's the main difference between our experiences, I think.
Because we're already at 52 minutes. Nostalgia is the theme today. You still want to get married?
Absolutely, I still want to get married.
People will listen, right?
Sure.
Right. No, you are not mistaken, internet friends. This is a subscriber storytime episode. That, however, was a trailer for my video podcast that I have with my fiance/partner, Alex, and we call it Thoughtcraft Cast. We have a lot of laughs and good conversations over there about the most random of shite. So if you're looking for a break from the darkness this week, it would mean the world to me if you check it out. We're on YouTube in video format, and if you just want to listen, we're on SoundCloud and iTunes and are working on getting on Google Play and Spotify. We have new episodes every Wednesday, and this week's episode was 2 Truths and a Lie, which was a lot of laughs and super fun. Thank you ahead of time to those of you who do check out the podcast. I'm done self-promoting. Into the video now. For episode number 22 of Subscriber Storytime, we have, I don't know how many stories. I don't know. But we have some. So grab yourself a snack, a drink, sit back, turn down the lights, and enjoy. When I was quite young, my single mother was a Canadian expat teaching English in Indonesia. After living in the core of Jakarta for a while, she realized it wasn't a safe atmosphere to raise her daughter. So we moved to a rural village. There were other children in the village, and their mothers were more than happy to keep an eye on me. I was fluent enough to attend the local school, so despite the lengthy commute for my mom, we settled in. After walking home from school, I usually checked in with our neighbor, Yati, a 60-something mother of 8 whose kids spanned the ages of 5 to 30. As long as it was light out, I was left to my own devices, often playing in the forest behind the village with Yati's younger children. When darkness fell, I wasn't allowed to go home alone, so dusk ushered us back to their house. Yati wasn't superstitious. Considering we'd once found a human ear in the forest, she was just being practical. Their home was L-shaped. 3 linked square rooms bisected a rectangular space that made up the kitchen and the open-air bathroom. There were no hallways, just 2 doors to each room, one connecting the spaces to one another, and the others leading outside. And outside at night was not an option. When night fell, Yati locked each outside door, followed by all of the inner doors while moving around inside the house. One particular night, I was tasked with helping Yati pound rice in while the 2 youngest sat in the living room watching TV at the far end of the home. After we finished, I followed Yati through her painstakingly slow process of unlocking and locking each inner door on the way to the living room. While waiting on the rice to set, a sudden clatter on the far end of the home disturbed the white noise of the TV. This alarmed no one, since large rats commonly find their way inside through the bathroom. But after more loud crashes from the kitchen, Yati left to investigate. The rice sat untouched, still covered, and nothing was amiss save a few plastic planters tipped over just outside the kitchen entrance. 5 minutes passed before a loud, wet thunk rattled the far end of the house. This sound was different and had us all scurrying behind Yati, whose protective instincts kicked in. This time, she found the rice spilled all over the floor, the pot knocked over. In the middle of cleaning up the mess, the empty pot soaking on the counter crashed to the concrete floor just behind us. There wasn't a trace of a single rat, and none of us had touched the pot. Yati turned, grabbed the sopping rag her son was using to clean up, and threw it out the door without a word. Then she grabbed her youngest daughter and I by our arms and ushered us urgently to the living room. None of us questioned her as she locked the doors between us and the kitchen, double-checking the outer doors locks in each room along the way. Once in the living room, she switched off the old TV and the lights. The four of us sat in dark silence. Frightened, the younger daughter began crying, but was quiet about it after seeing the look on her mother's face. Yati's son sat sullenly in the corner, more sour about Power Rangers being turned off than anything else. For a while, nothing happened. I sat there perfectly still, listening to the distant sounds of the forest outside, wondering if we'd overreacted. Then, an indistinct sound rose from the far end of the home, solidifying into the whine of a door opening. There was a rattling, followed by another creak of a door swinging on its hinges. The three of us children flew into Yati's corner, clambering over each other to be closest to her and the door leading outside. When the doorknob to the living room began to scrape and rattle, Yati fervently unlocked and flung open the outside door. We all dashed across the small space between our houses into my home. As quietly as we could, we shut the door closed behind us and pulled the shutters closed. Without a phone, we waited in silence just inside the door until my mom arrived home from the city. She was very concerned upon arrival, having seen Yati's place in darkness with all of the outside doors gaping open, even the ones she double-checked on our way to the living room. But Yati assured her it was not a problem. We children just got a little frightened. Although I told my mom what really happened, Yati would never talk about it or even explain to me what she thought might have happened. All I know is that she looked just as afraid as we were, and the four doors to the outside were definitely not open when we fled the house. Whoever or whatever was in the house didn't steal a thing, left the place intact, and didn't follow us. We never experienced it again, but I'm happy we escaped the living room before finding out who or what was behind the door. A few months ago, my best friend Tori and I moved into an apartment together. I've known Tori for 11 years, and the girl is a freaking magnet for all things paranormal. I felt the presence of angels and demons alike, heard voices that belong to people who aren't there, seen shadows standing at my bedroom door, felt cold breezes in rooms that aren't the least bit drafty, you name it. Over the years, I've gotten used to it, and it doesn't really affect me or bother me the way that it used to. I used to flip my shit and start cursing at whatever was scaring me. Now things will fall off of shelves for no reason, or I'll hear noises and whispers, and I barely give it a second thought before continuing about my business. That was disclaimer number 1. Disclaimer number 2. Neither Tori nor her boyfriend Isaac were intoxicated in any way, shape, or form on the night of this particular incident I'm about to share. Having paranormal encounters just comes with the territory of being Tori's friend. And this wasn't Isaac's first time dealing with some strange occurrences that seemed to follow Tori, who also, on occasion, sleepwalks. Isaac has severe insomnia, so when he stays the night, he often ends up on his phone or watching Netflix in the living room until he's tired enough to go upstairs to bed. That was his plan on the night in question, but something told him to stay awake, that he wasn't going to get much sleep that night. So he's laying in bed, messing around on his Twitter, when suddenly Tori sits up next to him. He sets his phone down and grabs Tori's shoulder to get her attention. She doesn't flinch or turn to look at him. He tries to get her to lay down, saying, "Come on, babe, no one's there." With force, she finally lays down. He holds her, trying to convince her she can go back to sleep, that everything is fine. She eventually nods off again, and he rolls away and gets back on his phone. Not even 5 minutes go by when she suddenly bolts out of bed and makes a beeline for the stairs. Isaac envisions her tumbling down the stairs in her sleepwalking daze, so he immediately takes off after her. He catches up and tries to pull her back into her room, but she breaks free, sprints down the stairs, and heads to the back door, Isaac trailing after her. When he catches up, she's hitting the sliding glass door, trying to break it. He pulls her away and asks her why she's trying to go outside in the middle of the night. He tells her that there's nothing out there and they should just go back to bed. After a moment, she looks back at the door, looks at Isaac, and then says she has to get outside because he is out there. Neither Isaac, nor I, nor Tori know who the hell he is. Isaac steers her towards the stairs when she comes to a halt, staring at the china cabinet in the corner. The cabinet was cherry with glass doors, a piece she'd inherited from her great-grandmother, whom she loved dearly. Her voice sounds detached, like she's not really here. Do you know how easy it would be to put my head through that glass? She tries to take a step towards it, but Isaac is ready, locking his arms behind her back and pushing her towards the stairs, the opposite direction of the cabinet. Again, she stops, this time when she sees her cat Luna sitting on the stairs. She looks frantically at Isaac and whispers, "Get her away from me." Isaac tries to shoo Luna away, but she doesn't move. He lets go of Tori's arms to pick her up, but Tori beats him to it, roughly snatching her beloved cat by the scruff of her neck, staring at her with a chillingly flat expression. Isaac manages to break her grip and sets Luna down, who runs into the bathroom unharmed but clearly terrified. Isaac eventually gets Tori up the stairs and into bed. He crawls in next to her and holds her to him as tight as he can, now wide awake. Then Tori turns her head and stares at him for a long moment, eyes unreadable. Then she whispers, "You know I'm not Tori, right?" A maniacal laugh bubbles up from her throat, getting louder, and then slowly petering out until she falls back into slumber mid-giggle. Isaac did not sleep that night. In the morning, Isaac relayed the events of the night to Tori. While he helped her get ready for work, she said it was a good thing he hadn't gone downstairs that night. He agreed, and Tori says, "No, you don't understand. If you had left me, I would have jumped out of my bedroom window to get outside." We're still not sure who he is that Tori was trying to get to. I've been prepared my whole life for paranormal experiences. Raised in southern, rural West Virginia on stories of ghosts and monsters from a very young age, my family's superstitions have always been clear to me. But as I've grown, I've become more of a skeptic. Only one encounter made me question that stance, and it started when I was 14. My early teen years were a bit wild. I had a habit of running away, smoking, and skipping school, to the point I had to transfer to a private school full of kids with similar problems. I found myself alone a lot, and I didn't have any real friends at the time. So I began looking online for any sort of social interaction. On New Year's Eve of 2011, I found more than I bargained for. After getting a spray tan one night, I fell severely ill with bacterial pneumonia. Unbeknownst to me at the time, I would be bedridden for nearly a month. So while I was sick, I found an app for meeting people in the area on my phone. Not necessarily for dating, but just to meet locals or those just a little farther out. I started looking for someone to message to pass the hours of laying in bed. I received a message from a man several years older than me, who I'll call Ken. Our messages the first night were pretty dry, with no real hope for any deeper conversation. But after that, I received a paragraph that changed my life. This stranger lived a state away, but told me details about me and my life he could have never gathered from my sparse profile or disinterested messages. He knows I sleep in my bathtub at night to quell my anxiety because I hate sleeping in an open bed, something only my parents know about me. He says he knows I'm in a bad situation and can't keep any friends, something only one of my classmates would know. He tells me that I'm scared, and I have every reason to be because I'm surrounded by a dark, engulfing energy that feeds off of any bit of positive energy that I have. He says this darkness comes from my family, through my mother. I assume because we bicker and fight constantly. However, I later found out this was not the case. The message went on to say that he is a strong empath and a reincarnation of the angel Jericho, something I am still very skeptical about. I don't know how to respond to the message, much less how to feel. I sat on my cold bathroom floor, absorbing and rereading his words. I don't remember my response verbatim, as this was many years ago, but I was dumbfounded and asked him for proof of his abilities. What I did next was especially stupid, but I was a delinquent 14-year-old who felt I had nothing left to lose in my life. He asked me to go outside. I told him I couldn't, that it was snowing too much. He asked if I could open my window instead, and I agreed. Opening my window was a hassle because I had my headboard against it to prevent anyone from getting in. But I managed to get it open, cold air rushing over me. He told me if I breathed in as much of the outdoor air as possible, he would be able to touch me. I didn't know what he meant since he was in another state, but I couldn't pass up a chance to be wrapped up in this weird mysticism. I sat next to the window and breathed in the cold winter air. For several minutes, nothing happened. I sent him a message telling him I didn't feel anything. He assured me it was coming, so I closed my eyes and kept breathing. This next part is where my story goes from somewhat plausible to a bit whimsical, but I swear I felt someone touch me, but not in a skin-to-skin way. It felt like warm static down my arm and thigh, like warm tingling of my limbs falling asleep, only the sensation moved across my skin upon its own volition. I never felt anything like it before, and I only felt it on nights where we arranged such window openings. Ken told me I had a spiritual leech attached to me, and that the leech knew he was there. We didn't talk more about it until later on. We messaged back and forth that night, but I felt my breathing becoming labored, like someone drained me of all my energy. I'd learn a week later that this feeling was my bacterial pneumonia, but going days with undiagnosed weakness and lethargy following a mysterious incident would leave anyone concerned. Ken and I became close for several months. Another problem I always had as a teen was being attracted to older men. At the same time as meeting Ken, I started dating a 20-year-old guy. Like I said, I felt I had nothing left to lose, and this guy bought me nice things, even an iPod Touch. Because the device wasn't monitored by my parents, and they didn't even know I had it, I would use it to FaceTime Ken, and we would talk hours into the night. I saw his face and heard his voice, and he was finally real to me. Our friendship carried on for months, but during this time, something happened. Late one night, after everyone had already gone to bed, I FaceTimed Ken under the covers to prevent any light from showing under my door. I asked him about the leech again, since I knew so little. He said there was a dark entity that attached itself to and fed off of my energy and livelihood. He felt it every time he visited me, but the entity was timid around people with strong energies. He said it often lurked just behind my closet door. There was a second or two of pause before my life changed for forever. I heard the disembodied, sinister laugh of a grown man emanate from next to my bed, right behind my back. Ken's eyes grew big on the iPod, as did mine. Ken said that was the leech and that he'd heard the laugh. There was no way it could have been Ken or coming from his end, as I used earbuds to talk to him. Everyone else in my house was asleep. Terrified, I couldn't stop the tears from coming. Ken then asked me if I used to see a man in my mother's closet when I was young. This was another fact about my life he shouldn't have known. At age 5, I was asleep in my mom's bed one night when I sat up, intending to go to the bathroom, only to be stopped dead in my tracks by what I saw in the closet. A man with dirty, grimy skin holding a bag. The streetlight went out just as I saw him, and I laid back down, terrified. I didn't tell my parents, and the streetlight didn't come back on for days. After relaying this to Ken, he confirmed the laugh from the closet, the man in the closet, were one and the same, the leech. There were no special tricks to make him go away, and the leech could only be removed by multiple empaths like Ken, and it would have to be done in person, which still hasn't happened to this day. My life continued on after this, but I still think about that night frequently, all of these seemingly impossible events being a part of my narrative. Ken and I eventually lost touch because my parents found out about my iPod and the older boyfriend. They were understandably furious and confiscated the iPod. 3 years later, when I was 17, I tried emailing Ken again. We caught up a bit and even talked on the phone. He was engaged with a baby on the way. I never had a chance to ask him about the leech again, though. His fiancée didn't like him talking to a younger girl, despite me being in a serious relationship at the time, and Ken and I having no romantic intent towards one another ever. That was the last I ever talked to him, and to this day, I still wonder how he's doing. When I was 18, my mom and I were catching up, and I told her about what happened to me. She is superstitious and open to these things, whereas my dad, who I am closer to, is not at all. She told me that she could tell something changed in my life around that time. I went from top of the class, never giving anyone a hard time, bubbly and fun, to a masochistic, hateful, bad decision machine. To my surprise, though, she had a story of her own to share. When she was a little girl, she had a similar experience to mine. While lying in bed one night, she was suddenly overcome with a sharp fear. Looking down at the foot of her bed, she saw sheer nothing, just blackness. Staring at it felt like falling, caught in the seconds just before hitting the ground, drawn out into an agonizingly long moment, a fear of being harmed. Years later, right after she had me, she saw it again. My mother had severe postpartum depression after I was born, bad enough that she was almost sent back to the hospital. For her, it took all of the happiness and fun out of having a new baby and made her feel like she was dying. My mother now understands why I felt the way I did during the worst chapter of my life, and I'm glad I told her. I don't know if I'll ever talk to Ken again or address this dark leech attachment that has, thankfully, remained silent, but I just hope if I have a daughter, it won't follow her, too. I'm a 23-year-old guy from the southern U.S., and this happened while I was a night shift cashier at a rundown gas station near the end of summer in 2013. I had just turned 19. The city I live in isn't big, about 10,000 people, but I've lived here most of my life, It's a decent place to raise a family, and also the most boring place in the world. However, in the not-so-nice areas, the bums, junkies, and drunks run rampant. The gas station I worked at was in one of those areas. My first week working there, it became apparent my coworkers were unreliable and would quit out of nowhere. In the first 5 days, I ran off a woman trying to do heroin in the bathroom, some creep trying to pick up 2 13-year-olds, and I had more than a few threats thrown my way by a couple of drunks on the no-sell list, which I just laughed off. I eventually grew accustomed to the type of dumbasses that shopped there from time to time. After about a month of working there and being the only employee worth anything, I had the occasional lone shift. I thought nothing of it, though. The store stayed empty for the most part. One particularly slow autumn night, I noticed the silhouette of a tall, skinny man in the distance, walking towards the store. When he got closer, I could see he was in his early 30s, unshaven with stringy dark hair, wearing a filthy gray zip hoodie, no shirt underneath, black sweatpants, and unlaced boots. Something about him gave me the fucking chills. As he walked in the door next to the register, he glanced at me with a cold, dead, emotionless expression, then quickly stared at the floor, shuffling along, browsing the aisles, glancing up at me every few seconds. He stumbled around for 2 or 3 minutes, never taking his hands out of his hoodie pockets, before hurriedly exiting out the side door. I assumed he'd stolen something to eat, but at that point, I didn't really care. The guy was obviously high, and I wasn't about to get stabbed over a Twinkie. Not to mention that my manager had turned into a real asshole lately, and I'd entertained thoughts of quitting, so he could have taken the whole box of Twinkies for all I cared. The very next day, I was scheduled on a lone 3 to 11 p.m. shift. The afternoon was surprisingly peaceful. A few old people, a couple of cute girls, and a guy wearing a suit who seemed in a hurry. Not many people came in that evening either, but I wasn't complaining. Then, at around 10, I see that familiar, tall, skinny silhouette in the distance. The man from the previous day came walking down the street, this time, hand shoved in his pocket like he had a gun, heading towards the entrance. The bell on the door led to a moment of tense, complete silence. He stared at me for a few seconds, seemingly sizing me up, then went right to browsing the aisles and glancing up at me. By this point, my adrenaline is pumping. I'm alone, I don't know if he's armed, and I don't know what to do if he tries something. A few minutes later, he comes up to the counter holding a small bottle of water and $2 between his fingers, still staring at me. His right hand never left his pocket. I rang him up and handed him his change. He stood there for about 10 seconds, eyes still locked onto me. Then, in a foreboding, deep voice, he says, "You need to call the police." My heart sank. "Excuse me?" "You need to call the police." As soon as he finished repeating himself, he walked out the door. Needless to say, I took that advice as fast as I fucking could. I locked all the doors, went to the back, and called the cops. A squad car eventually pulled up, and after giving my statement, I went home. I quit not long after that. I finally had enough of my manager and all the bullshit that came along with that job. I think about those 2 nights fairly often. I never heard from the police, and I've never seen that man again, which is strange in a town where you recognize almost every face. The only possible theory I have is this. He knew someone was planning something that night at the store, and calling the cops scared them off their plan. There was nobody around, and the store was completely empty, save for me, and it would have been the perfect opportunity to rob the place, or worse. What if he hadn't told me to call the police? Would someone have showed up, shoved a gun in my face, and taken the money in the register? or taken my life instead? Or was he just a deranged stranger? Either way, I'm glad I quit that job. Since I was in the 5th grade, I've been fascinated with the American Civil War, partially because my elementary school had the older kids throw a fair, and because I grew up in Virginia. The story that follows changed me forever as I uncovered the darkness of death beneath the rose-tinted fantasies fed to me as history. My mom traveled for work back then, and every once in a while she would take me on her trips. We would listen to country music in between hotels, and I had the opportunity to see sights beyond the borders of Virginia. When I was 14, my mom knew that we were driving by Gettysburg and thought I would probably enjoy some of the historical theatrics there. The historic part of town was packed with actors, old-timey theaters, souvenirs, candy, and costume shops. I got a keychain, saw Pirates of Penzance, and took very, very shitty photos of emo me and my mom enjoying ourselves. To end the day, we went to the battlegrounds of Gettysburg, home to the bloodiest 3 days of American history. It was scorching, well into July. We moseyed through the dusty museum, looking at old guns and cannons and scraps of uniforms. At this point, I was tired from the day's shenanigans and the heat. My stomach was churning from the stress, and I'd had my fill. I was ready to leave. When our tour ended, my mom and I opted to take the road adjacent to the battlefield. The AC blowing and the dust trailing, we saw acres of grassy, rolling hills. We inexplicably fell silent, listening to the engine hum in the rental car. As someone who has had panic attacks bad enough to be hospitalized for them, I know what happened to me that day was not an exaggeration or a joke. Looking over the fields that I now knew were soaked in blood and suffering, my chest began to tighten, and I felt like all of the blood in my body drained out of my toes. My head spun, and I was full of what I can only describe as despair, anxiety, and massive uneasiness. A few minutes crawled by, and then it felt like the minutes slowed to a stop. The pit of dread and anxiety in my center grew and grew with every passing second my mom drove further into the battlefields. Without realizing it, my vision had started to blur, almost like a mist. I looked over to my mom, who gripped the wheel tightly, and quietly I said, "Mom, I really don't feel well." "I don't either," she replied. She promptly made a U-turn in the middle of the road and drove us out of the park and away from whatever dread had overcome us. As we got further and further away, we talked more about what had just happened. We'd both felt okay that morning, and the AC from the rental was cool, so it wasn't the heat. We never mentioned it again after that day, but I think we had a silent agreement that the answer to what happened lay on those battlegrounds and their bloody history. The weight of the experience made me double-take my perspective on this very terrible time in history. Those fields are something that I can only describe as being marked by death itself, and that day continues to haunt both me and my mother. Ever since I was a child, I've had ghostly experiences, attracting the paranormal and unexplainable, but one incident always stands out when I look back. My story starts in 2013. I was 11, freshly starting secondary school. My school had a tradition of sponsoring a walk from our small town to the next. You could do the walk in a group or alone. You're allowed to roam freely along the trails. At the time, I was very naive and stubborn, and during the walk, my friends and I had an argument, ended with me walking far ahead of them in the woods. Just me and my thoughts. The longer I walked, though, my annoyance at my friends waned and an unease crept in. It was strange knowing there were 800 students on the walk, yet I was alone and hadn't seen anyone else for several minutes. I was walking along a wide path with steep and rocky ditches along either side. The trees' canopies intertwined together from either side of the trail, letting only small cracks of light through. Down at the end of the trail was a field of crops. To cope with my unease, I told myself to just keep going, don't look back, and only forward. However, I felt a strange urge to look down into the ditch just off the trail. Trying to ward off my creeping anxiety, I looked down into the ditch and saw a girl. A girl too young to be on the walk and definitely too young to be in the woods alone. I wanted to ask if she was okay, but my mouth couldn't form the words. I stood frozen, staring at this girl when I realized she wasn't dressed in modern clothes, maybe not even from this century. She edged forward and time seemed to slow. Seconds felt like minutes and I felt trapped, like I was in a trance of some sort. Then she looked past me and her face contorted into a horrified scream. Not wanting to see what was behind me, I took off at a sprint and didn't stop until I found my friends again. They could tell something was wrong beyond our earlier fight, but that was far from my mind as I explained what I had just seen. They said they didn't hear anyone scream and that they were some of the last people to still be walking the trails. Still spooked, we found a teacher close by and walked the rest of the way with them. 4 years have passed and I am still confused. I can still feel the hairs on my neck stand up as I tell this story, but one thing I know for sure, what I saw that day will stay with me for the rest of my life. My story is part strange family history and part personal experience that stems from that history. My maternal grandfather's parents were immigrant refugees from Korea who moved to the U.S. back in the early 1900s. My great-grandmother, in particular, suffered a lot back in Korea. She was the member of a high-status noble family, could write and read in Korean and Chinese, and was targeted by the invading Imperial Japanese forces. All of the men in her household were murdered, including her first husband. She and her infant daughter were smuggled out of the country through Shanghai and were sent to the U.S. via a mail-order bride service to my great-grandfather, who was living as a farmer in Colorado. There's no telling exactly what horrors she experienced back in her homeland, as she rarely ever spoke of them. When the U.S. got involved in World War II, my grandfather, my great-grandparents' only son, was determined to join the Air Force in the war effort. My great-grandmother was opposed to this, especially after a dream she had. She had visions of her dead ancestors singing, and she woke terrified. It was an extremely bad omen in Korean culture that pointed to a death in the family in the immediate future. She was certain her only son would be killed if he joined the war effort. She begged and pleaded him to stay home, desperate to keep him safe. But my grandfather joined the Air Force anyway, and served until the war ended. When he came back, he was thrilled to show his mother that he'd made it home safe without a single scratch on him. But what he came back to shocked him. His mother had gone to the hospital for a hysterectomy during his leave, and due to complications related to undiagnosed diabetes, had died on the operating table. The funeral had passed, and she was already buried in the cemetery. Nobody told him or any of his sisters who were all away at college, because they were all very busy and nobody wanted to distress them and disturb their work. This might shock some people, but this isn't abnormal in a lot of Korean families. Everyone then realized my great-grandmother hadn't predicted her son's death, but her own. I never met my great-grandmother, but I always felt a strong emotional and spiritual bond with her. Fast forward to around 2014 or 15. All of my great-grandparents' children passed away by then, save for the youngest, my great-aunt. She was somewhat ill and had gone to the hospital, but was released and now at home. This was all the information most of the family knew. Only her husband and children knew she died very soon after she returned home. It turns out she had terminal cancer and knew she was going to die. She'd only told her husband and children since they were responsible for her care anyways. The rest of the family didn't find out until a little later. She didn't want people to worry and interrupt everyone's busy lives just so they would go see her. I attended her funeral to pay my respects to the last child of an ancestor I always felt close to. On the drive home from the funeral, though, I realized something very strange. A few weeks before, I'd had a strange dream. An older woman stood in front of me, singing to me as if trying to lull me to sleep or calm me down. There was an undercurrent of urgency in her voice, though, as I stared at her broad, sad face. The woman looked Korean, which wasn't odd since a fourth of my family is, but something about her felt important. It's hard to explain any other way. On the car ride home from the funeral, I realized that I'd seen that face in my dream before, in an old black and white photograph of my great-grandparents standing outside on their farm in Colorado. It was my great-grandmother who had been singing to me. I'd had almost the same dream as she had in the 1940s. I'm absolutely certain it was my great-grandmother alerting me that her last child was about to pass on. She was urging me to go to her daughter's funeral in her stead. I'm still so immensely glad I went to my great-aunt's funeral that I can't even put into words. My great-grandmother has visited me more times since, and I deeply hope that she will sing to me one last time just before I die. Special thanks to the Patreon family who are now more vital to this channel's survival than I can say, due to the recent demonetization of almost every new Dark Matters and Nameless that has come out. The names you see on screen are just some of the people who financially contribute to this channel. Whether they are passionate about subscriber story times or true crime cases, their support cannot be overstated. If you are interested in supporting the channel, information is in the description, but even if you only continue to support by watching, thank you. And of course, a special thanks to the subscribers who chose to share their stories with us today. We have Tara, Bella of the North, Amanda, Zach, Liz, Megan 190302, and Myung. If you had a personal terrifying encounter you've had, it can be paranormal or not, please feel free to send it to subscriberstorytime@gmail.com and your experience might end up in the next subscriber storytime. If you wish to stay anonymous, please mention that in your email, and remember, grammar matters, paragraphs matter. Thank you. Thank you for watching the video, and most of all for continuing to support the channel and be an absolutely amazing community. Stay safe, friends, and have a good... I wrote have a good. What does that mean? I think I've done that before. Stay safe, friends. Have a good night.